Welcome everyone to the future of work. I'm sure this is maybe a second, third event for some of y'all, but for those of you just tuning in for the first time, welcome to our TTS event. Tech Talent South is a technical education company. We exist to build and connect tech and entrepreneurial ecosystems. So we do that in a few ways. We train individuals and help them to upskill. Number of technical topics there, ranging from full stack web development to data science, number of other great things tucked in there as well. And we do a lot of corporate training, and then we help to meet talent acquisition needs through talent training and placement programs. So we can talk about that later. I'll be sure to email you some resources, but tonight specifically, we have a really brilliant panel put together. I won't steal your thunder, y'all. I'll let you share your accolades in just a minute, but we'll be exploring the future of work. So this will be casual. I don't want to make you all feel like you have to answer every question or go in any particular order. So feel free to speak as you feel led, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. To kick us off, if you'd like to just introduce yourself, talk a bit about your background. Everyone here has such a unique, specific set of skills that brought them to where they are today, and I'd love just to highlight those, and then we can dive into the conversation. I see Gant in the top of my screen. Do you want to kick us off?
Happily.
Awesome.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Gant Laborde, born in New Orleans as a native and sort of the nerd before my time. Unfortunately, I've been in businesses and tech for a long time, pretty much alone for a bit. And it's been really cool because I've actually watched through Tech Talent South and a bunch of other people coming to New Orleans and helping build a tech community. I have built tons of businesses and helped quite a few startups. And there's a large list of successes and failures along that road. 20 years in tech and sort of like workforce and managing. And I've learned quite a bit along the way, and I'm happy to share any of that stuff with whoever might find it valuable.
Thanks, Gant. Ariel, would you like to go next?
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. My name is Ariel Lopez. I am the founder and CEO of NAC. It's a hiring platform that makes it easier for companies to screen, manage, and give feedback to applicants in their pipeline. If you've ever gotten a canned rejection email or gotten ghosted in your job search, we are trying to solve that problem. I started my career in recruiting a little over a decade ago now. So from staffing agencies, shout out to anyone that's ever worked agency side as a recruiter. I think that's where you earn your stripes. And then I ended up kind of transitioning into career coaching. My last job was actually at General Assembly. And that's when I started to do a deep dive on ed tech and all things related to the skills gap that exists in this country. And more importantly, figuring out ways to help people gain employment in careers that they love.
Thank you so much. Quentin, would you like to go next? Oh, let's see here. I'll unmute you just a moment. All right. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hey.
Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. Quentin Messer Jr. I'm also in New Orleans. I come at it from the economic development side. I work with an organization called the New Orleans Business Alliance. We're an accredited economic development organization focused on growing the New Orleans economy in an inclusive way. And I guess very briefly, we can talk about it later, is that COVID-19 has kind of laid bare things that we always knew were challenges that we were facing in New Orleans. We were very vulnerable to things that will attack socialization the way that COVID-19 has. As Gant mentioned, he's been at the front lines trying to diversify our economy. We're still too tourism and hospitality heavy, maritime heavy, oil and gas heavy, three sectors that have really taken a lot of brunt from COVID-19, but also they're the same sectors that are going to face some challenges with climate change. So I look forward to talking a little bit about how do we have to upskill reskill and hopefully leverage the talents that are in some other urban areas in the South, like New Orleans.
Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Lyle, we'd love to hear about you.
Sure thing. I'm honored to be here. And I think I am absolutely last and least. It seems like there are accomplished panelists. My name is Lyle LeBlanc. I am also born and raised in New Orleans, so the 504 representing. I run Scale Workspace and Scale Innovations, formerly known as EntreScan, same thing, just changing names all the time. And basically it is a mix of a co-working space with a focus on advanced manufacturing, right? I don't have 20 years of experience. I've got about 6 years of experience in an industry that seems to change kind of every 6 months, every 3 months. So that started exclusively as a 3D printing company about 5 years ago, and kind of turned into a more advanced manufacturing company. And it's now part of a real estate company. And so lots of very small, maybe not so simple, but certainly built to pivot. Yeah, eager to kind of continue this conversation. And my background is certainly pretty atypical, I think, as we talk a bit more. I went to, I have a degree in theology, so certainly not manufacturing, nothing tech related at all. And I lived abroad in China for a year to learn Mandarin, to have some sort of technical skill under my belt. And then came back and was like, well, nobody here speaks Mandarin, so I should probably learn. Actually showed up to Hack Night here in New Orleans with a bunch of electronics once upon a time, and they were like different Hack Night. And so I was way more into tinkering and kind of building physical things than I was, I guess, suited for the coding life. But it turns out they're all mixed, and there are all sorts of alternative pathways to skill up and get a job. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And for those who just joined us, thank you for being here. Please be submitting your Q&A throughout the event. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box. We'll save some time after we run through the panel questions to answer all the questions you have. So we'd love to hear from you. Without further ado, my first point is super general, and I think that each of you come from very different backgrounds, so it'll be sort of fun to hear your take on this. But just generally speaking, how has the way that we work changed over the course of your career? And I mean that in a really wide sense. It could be like the physical space that we're doing work. It could be management strategy, how people are managed and how teams are built. We could talk about use of technology and how that's changed over your career. But what have you seen to date, and what does it look like for you in your walk?
I guess I'll begin. I think I'm the oldest. So when I finished college in 1991, that was probably before some of you were even born. We didn't have, it was still the fax machine. You didn't have smartphones. You would sometimes have to physically deliver. I worked in investment banking. So you have to physically sometimes fly with responses to RFPs because the file share size capability wasn't there. So, obviously as technology made things easier, it's changed. I think the three biggest ways for me is really more from how management engages with employees. When I came out of undergrad, you would go to wherever the job was. It didn't matter if it was in wherever, pick a place that you had no roots, no anchor, but there was a job, you would go. I think the good news about places in the South, particularly some place like New Orleans, is people want to be in New Orleans. So a lot of talent is sort of saying, hey, we're going to where we want to be. And now as we've all learned, hey, I guess we can really work remotely. You're going to see a lot of people gravitate and go and live wherever they want to live, and then force companies to say, okay, if you really want me, you will accept that I live in New Orleans, but I work for a company headquartered in Amsterdam or headquartered in Singapore or wherever it might be. So that was the second great thing. The second thing, I think the third thing is And I think this is challenging for leadership sometimes to understand this, is that my colleagues who are younger want to know the why of a particular directive. You know, when I was coming up, you were just told, like, go do X, Y, and Z. You didn't, rarely would you ask why. Now you would ask, well, certain questions to sort of help you be more efficient, but people really want to understand the underlying rationale. So I think for people who are in their 40s, or like me in their early 50s, you really need to think about how you engage with young people. And it's not sort of people are challenge you, but I think really the younger folks really want to try to understand why, because frequently they have greater ideas to make whatever you ask them to do better. And so you have to take that extra time to do so. So those are some of the three biggest changes I've seen.
Yeah. I agree with Quentin that, we're actually on a really big circle here. If you go back 200 or so years, people lived and worked in the same kind of space. If you were, you just kind of lived and you worked exactly where you were. You can kind of see this when you visit Europe a little bit. And what's really funny is people had that choice, like Quentin was saying. You go where you want to go, and then you do your profession. And then we lost that in the Industrial Revolution. It was important for everybody to go be on site and go be this particular way. So sort of like you said in 91, when you're graduating, we were coming off of this curve of everyone, you didn't have a choice anymore. You had to go someplace. And it seems like, weirdly enough, through the technological ways, it's cool now to say, hey, I want to do this, but I want to do this from here. It's sort of like that big circle that we see where, people had beautiful wooden floors, but when carpet was in style in the 80s, everybody covered those beautiful floors with carpet. And then now everybody's ripping up that carpet to show this beautiful wooden floor again. It's like a circle, and we're kind of seeing, I think that helps us predict a little bit of what you can see coming up as you kind of regain your choice of where you can work from.
Yeah, I definitely would echo all of the thoughts as in regards to remote work. I think when I started my career, well, I grew up in North Carolina, but I moved to New York, and it's so funny. I just tweeted about this the other day, but I think we're going to see like a newer version of the Great Migration in this country, because so many people have moved to markets like New York and San Francisco and LA in hopes of chasing the dream, right? I was no different. I just didn't know I was going to land in recruiting. I just knew I needed to move to New York because I was going to figure it out when I got there. And over the course of 10 years, I realized, you know what, maybe I don't need to live here to actually be successful and grow my business and do all the things that I wanted to do. So I actually moved to Atlanta last year. I just made a year here a few months ago. Thank you. So I feel like I saw the writings on the wall way before the pandemic. Like, I can do this at a lower cost in just as good of a market that has just as much access to talent and corporations. And I think Atlanta definitely embodies that. Similarly to New Orleans, Austin, Raleigh, Durham. There's so many cities throughout the Southeast that I think are going to be heavily impacted over the next few years as people start to come in. So that's probably been one of the biggest things that stand out for me. I would also just mention like management style as well. I think the idea of the 40-hour work week. I remember my first job, we had to be there at 8:30 a.m. You couldn't leave until like 6 o'clock. And if you left at 6, then, they're going to talk about you when you leave. So stay until 7 because it's the right thing to do. To now, I think, employees are getting their power back. And that's the most exciting thing, or maybe even the silver lining in the midst of all of this chaos. I think managers and leadership as a whole are going to have to rethink of ways to make employees happy. And it's not enough to have, ciggies and free-flowing wine and beer in your cafeteria or, give someone 1 month of sabbatical after they've stayed at the company for 2 years. I think they're going to have to completely rethink, the foundation of employee engagement, everything from onboarding to the overall experience. So I'm actually really excited about the future of work right now because I think there's going to be a lot of innovation to come.
Yeah, I agree with everyone, and so much so that I've forgotten where the question was initially, but I've got a thing to say, so I'm ready anyway. And for me, it's about kind of how things have changed so far, and it has to do with the role of expertise, right? Right, so graduating with a degree in theology and not wanting to be a priest or a theologian, right? It's like, how do I convince somebody I'm an expert at something, or I am good enough at something that they can pay me to do it? And right, Google and YouTube are clearly the answers on, the world we live in is so connected. I think it's interesting. I think that's one of the things that I think this pandemic has shown more than anything is that we have to try really, really hard to keep people separate, right? We're literally breathing the same air, right? We have to tell you to stay home. We go to the same grocery store. There's so many points of connection. And that's also true kind of digitally when it comes to okay, great. So I am 5 years into running a 3D printing company, and I'm still Googling stuff on how do I do this, right? Or how do I 3D model this? And I read an article a while back, I think it was in the Atlantic, about expertise is dead, right? Because the rules in my industry change so fast, right? There's no such thing as an expert, right? So you can have an expert in chess or violin, right? And Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour, take it or leave it, whatever, that makes sense if the rules don't change. I can just practice and practice and practice, and I can get really good at it. But if that is not the case for additive manufacturing or just, kind of what we do, that changes, right? The Internet of Things. So we bought an $80,000 printer, 5 years ago, and literally was not connected to the internet at all, right? I had to manually connect a machine to download this cryptic text log file, versus a $3,500 printer now that has Wi-Fi, has this beautiful web-based dashboard that tells me how many prints did I send, what's my failure rate, what material am I using the most of, when should I order some next material. And so if you've kind of built your business around, or your skill set around oh, I'm an expert on this, and you're so rigid, and you're not really, I don't think you're going to survive in our industry there. But it's also liberating. That's where I can take, so we've hired employees through alternative programs like the Youth Empowerment Project, and some other ones where it's hey, if you can work here for 6 weeks, and at the end of 6 weeks, if you can do these 5 things, I know you've got a job, and I'm going to basically pay you to learn what you're doing as you do it. And as long as you're Googling enough and asking the right questions, and to some of that, asking the why, right? I think one of the things that Quentin was talking about on I'm telling you to 3D print this thing, right? And then someone will be why? I can cut it on a table saw way faster, right? And you're good call, way cheaper, let's do it that way. Or let's put the table saw in here. So I think that trying to weave things in together there, that the pace at which things are changing is logarithmic, right? I didn't make that up, someone else did. But the point is, the rules are changing so fast that having that kind of generalist skill set and the ability to communicate, right? So I've worked with people who are way smarter than me, and are super talented at database management, right? And it's I don't understand if you're speaking English or not, right? What's the problem you're solving, and how are you doing it, and what do you need from me? And they get really frustrated and pull their hair out. And it's I don't know, right? So that I think those communication skills and the ability to have that diverse skill set on the at a minimum, right? So it's one thing to be really have a honed expertise, but unless that niche is there and you can communicate with the other people, I think the future of work is changing more towards this as more things get automated. That kind of generalist skill set on I need to know enough to respond, and I need to know where to look or who to ask, so that I can find that.
Well, I want to say this kind of ties into part of what we were talking about earlier, is that, and you say that the expert is dead, and I'd say the traditional expert is dead, because if you take a look at scholastic endeavors from a really bad way of handling things, they taught memorization, rote memorization, because that curriculum was written in a time where it was very difficult to go to a library. You had to catch the bus to the library and then get out and grab the book and then look up that information. So the optimization that everything was, and it's still, we're teaching kids this way, which it drives me nuts, is that we're teaching this, become an expert in the memory. But I say, like, you definitely hit the 2 points. It's changed. Today's experts and traditional and the new work of an expert is, like you said, communication, because people haven't changed. People are, the better you get with that, communication is always key. And then knowing how to look stuff up, not knowing to ask why, so that you go look stuff up. Being trained on how to get information in this everything's at our fingertip world is the new expert.
I agree.
That was great. Off to an enlightening start, y'all. Well, we're in a really unique climate right now, obviously, and I'd love just to dive a little bit into how the current climate in this pandemic has changed and how it's impacting the way we work, and what you foresee being a lasting change. Like, how do you see this pandemic impacting the future of work, and what do you think will revert back to the old normal?
I will be the first to say that there will not be an old normal. I think that the new normal is up for us to define. And I think that's probably like the most exciting part about this pandemic is it's giving everyone a chance to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what works for our organization, what doesn't, how do we make that different? And I think there's a couple of things. First, this is not typical remote work, right? Like, I've been working from home in and out of co-working spaces over the last 4 years. Funny enough, just now did I find permanent space in Atlanta, which I cannot use because of the pandemic, but there's that. And, it's different to have that flexibility. And I think that's what most people are wanting. That's the sexiness of working remote, right? Like, flexibility of my time,
Yeah.
no one looking over my shoulder, having to micromanage me. And I think most people recognize that, hey, I can probably get 7 hours of work done in 4 if I know how to manage my calendar. So I think, that efficiency and that flexibility, all of those things are part of the benefits of working remotely. However, under the lens of a pandemic, that looks completely different, right? Like, it's not like you can go out to Starbucks or your favorite coffee shop and sit there for 2 hours and stare out the window. Like, that's gone now. I have yet to have kids, and I thank God that I don't have any at this moment. I talk to my friends that, definitely other founders, and obviously anyone that's working that has children. How do you homeschool? No one was prepared to do that. There wasn't a blueprint or a toolkit to say, hey, this is how you manage work and also manage home in the wake of a pandemic. So it's literally everyone trying to kind of figure it out as they go. And then obviously the pandemic brings, anxiety. I hate having to leave and being like, oh man, I forgot my mask. Let me go back and get it. Like, I long for the days when that didn't happen. And that's just a part of reality right now. So I say all of that to say, if you are working remotely right now, as we all are, just know this is not typically what it looks like. And I hope that over time you can reap the benefits of how remote work should look. I think one of the long-standing differences, though, is just going to be the physical space itself. I would argue that the majority of the tech industry has been embracing remote work over the last 5 to 10 years, right? Most of my friends that work at Google or Facebook or Twitter go into the office 2-3 days a week as needed. The only difference is they're not going there at all anymore. Obviously, Twitter made the announcement that it's work from home permanent. I heard earlier that Square also made that announcement as well. So it's just going to be interesting to see what companies come forward in the coming weeks, coming months, making similar announcements. But I also do think that anyone that returns to an actual physical space, the office environment is going to look completely different. Like, I laughed about the cafeterias because tech companies have ridiculous ones. Literally, Dropbox has a restaurant in their cafeteria that's nicer than any restaurant you can go to in San Francisco. And all that shut down, right? Like, what happens to the chefs? What happens to the baristas? What happens to all of the people that work in ops to make these tech companies operate? That's something that sticks with me. And I think also just the employee experience as a whole. We all kind of say how we hate work, and I think all of us recognize, like, man, I do kind of miss my coworkers. You know, even if I don't want to be around them all the time, it's nice to have some type of interaction. So I think it's going to be really interesting how companies find ways to cultivate community with the lack of the physical space, because I don't think it's going to come back as we once knew it.
Interesting. For me, the kind of, I guess for the manufacturing industry, this trend is like almost reversed, at least during, as relates to COVID, right? So we've seen like a supreme, like, hey, it's cool. Like, you know, I guess 12 weeks ago, you could get what you needed off Amazon or whatever, right? And now it's like, who in my city has it, or who has the tools to make that thing, right? And so we've seen our kind of, I guess, clients really go from, that circle's gotten a lot smaller. And so there's this, hey, you know, on a macroeconomic scale, right? Like, all right, so someone's going to design the thing in New York, and we're going to engineer it in Germany, and we're going to manufacture it in China, and we're going to store it somewhere in the Midwest so that we can drop ship really cheaply. And now it's like, no, right? Like, we need things faster. We need, like, that is shut down, right? At the moment. And so we made PPE, right? Like, is the most, I guess, time or sensitive or related project to this that we've been involved on, where a hospital's like, hey, we need these things not like 2.5 months from now, right? Like an 8-week lead time, crazy, right? Like, we need some today, tomorrow. What can you do? And that's been a really, I think the biggest change to our business is we've been, you know, the tools of manufacturing are how you produce physical goods, right? And a lot of that is still software based, right? So I'm not trying to be like, oh, like, I'm still relevant to Tech Talent South, right? You use software to create these things, and you can even code for it. But those tools have gotten smaller and smaller, right? Just like your phone has gotten smaller and your computers have gotten smaller, so have these like industrial pieces of equipment. But what hasn't happened is no one's really kind of, even though the rules have changed, no one's really come forward with this new paradigm yet, right? So a really good analogy I'd say is when like electricity first started being a thing, people were talking about how it's going to change factories, right? Which used to have these like mechanical belts that would like power all these workstations, right? And there was like this one drivetrain that would run all the way through to power these individual machines. And when electric motors became a thing, they just like changed this, like, you know, river, like water wheel or however they were powering it to an electric motor, and the layout of the factory didn't change at all. It wasn't until someone was like, wait a second, we could put like this kind of work way over there and this kind of work way over there, that the factory and the assembly lines like kind of really became a thing. And you're seeing that happen again with like, oh wait, like I've got, you know, instead of having one factory that's like big and in China, can I have like, you know, 25 mini factories that are spread out around the globe, and I can like email files from one team to another team so they can make things local. And that's kind of, you know, I've been trying to spread that message on the like, hey, distributed manufacturing is a thing, or, you know, manufacturing as a service, right? So I don't need to make 250,000 pieces of plastic the exact same in order to have a viable business model. I can make, you know, 15 different ones, and deliver them, you know, within a week. And then, you know, same way that software can get an update on the like, ooh, caught a bug, right? Like I can get feedback from the hospital or someone else, and the next one that I produce the next day can be different or have that feedback built in. And that's, you know, a paradigm that happened probably 5 years ago, but the world hasn't really needed a chance to like really test that system until COVID-19 on the like, oh my God, who do I know with a 3D printer or a laser cutter or a CNC router, right? Because like I need this stuff tomorrow. And then you can just send them a link to a file, and as long as they have the material, they can make it, right? And so I think COVID has, because of the fall or the hiccup, rather, it hasn't completely collapsed, and it'll certainly come back, of this kind of global supply chain model. I think there's now this kind of case study, same way there is for remote work, for this like distributed manufacturing, which is like, wait a second, there's a different way to do it. You know, so if the US is really going to reshore manufacturing, let me tell you, it's not going to be by building like the giant factories that are in Zhengzhou or Guangzhou, right? It's like, it's going to have to look different. So, yeah.
Yeah. The industry is really polarized. I've seen that. To agree with you, both of you are seeing two separate sides of that. What's really funny is I've always worked remote. So funny enough, I've been flooded with work. And just to reinforce, Ariel's 100% correct. Remote work is not work from home. Those are kind of pretty different. So if you feel like you're got quarantine fever, remote work's a lot more liberating but during this time, it's very constrained, and everybody's kind of going through the same thing. And so I'm seeing tons of work. I go outside for a second just to breathe, and I see dads riding bikes with their kids, and they don't have to go back to work at all for some reason. And so I think the industry has seen this is very, very difficult for some of us. Some people are dying to go back to work because they're very afraid that their job won't be there if they don't. So the fire that we're sort of seeing is going to either turn that, we're going to turn this carbon into a diamond, or we're going to fall apart. And I think that that's the opportunities that we're seeing here. Ariel and Lyle are saying, there's growth. Companies will say, we don't have to go back and have a cubicle for you, and then people are saying, the US doesn't have to stay well behind the supply trains of China. We could figure out something new here. And I think like the engaging discussions like we have here are part of how we get to that.
Yeah, I would say, ditto to previous three speakers. I'll just maybe raise three things that could be challenges. I think what this situation has really displayed is that there will be certain jobs and certain job categories that technology may affect the number, but it may not affect fundamentally the way the work still gets done. You could maybe, trash collection. You have automatic trash collection, but you still got to have, and yes, you could have semi-autonomous vehicles driving, but you got to have probably somebody making sure that you're not taking out cars or mailboxes or just having the cans all over the street. Those folks, those men and those women who are those sanitation engineers can't really social distance from anything, really. I think the second thing I think we're realizing is the primacy of education and critical thinking skills. You have to be able to adapt. I think everyone has sort of talked about, whether it's a depth of expertise or being wedded, well, this is the job you told me I would do. Well, we're seeing now it's hard to think beyond 2-week windows right now, or even 2 weeks may be too long, because you get new information, you're constantly changing, you're asking people to play maybe different roles than they would have ordinarily thought. And then I think the final point about the future of work is I think there's a mental health component that we have to think through. Isolation. I mean, yes, it's liberating, but I think it's liberating for some people because they have a choice, or they know how to engage using technology with friends. They don't feel alone. But I know there are a lot of folks in my age group in their early 50s or in their 50s who were not technology natives. And there were people who were just figuring out how to FaceTime with friends. Now you're talking Zoom and Slack and all these things that are second nature to the rest of my panelists. But, I was just telling someone I finally figured out today on my own how to share a screen on Zoom. And I felt like, wow, I've accomplished something. And all my colleagues were like, yeah, you old fart, you're right. But it is what it is. But I think the social isolation does give me pause, and we have to figure out, the best companies will figure out a way how to get around that. Because I do think, most humankind are social. And I do think you're going to see a lot of people elect not to go back into a formal work environment as I've known it. But I do think a lot of those folks will be people who have family, who have the social aspect, or a partner, or they live in somewhere where there's great socialization. But for a lot of folks, particularly younger folks who are delaying family and they're living in places that have a lot of 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom apartments, I do worry about, because I've heard people talk about, people I was surprised to hear about how isolated and disconnected they feel. So I think the smartest companies are going to think about the psychological nature of work, the whole human being, as it were.
Just really quick plug. I just found out about this 2 days ago. If anyone is unemployed on the Zoom, or someone that is, Headspace is giving away, I want to say 1 to 3 month free subscriptions for those that have been impacted by COVID. And I think that's absolutely amazing. For those of you that don't know, Headspace is a mental health startup. They have an app that you can download where you can take guided meditations. If I'm not mistaken, they may even be able to connect you to therapists or mental health providers. And I'm just so happy, Quentin, that you did mention that, because I think mental health is one of those things that does not get discussed enough, as it's related to, work and doing your best work. I've advised a lot of people in their job searches over the years. And I think one of the biggest challenges that everyone faces at some point is that feeling of defeat. What happens when you're constantly dealing with rejection? What happens when something like a layoff, which is completely unexpected, happens? What happens when there's a death in the family? Obviously many people have lost their lives to this pandemic, and it's sobering. I don't think you can truly be present and wake up and not recognize what's going on around us. So making sure that you're taking that time to take care of yourself and your mental health is so imperative. So my hope is that companies step up those efforts. They should be giving Headspace away for free to anyone that works for them anyway. But for anyone, any individuals on the call, I did want to just make that public, because I think it's great. And my hope is that other people in that space start to step up and do the same thing.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Ariel, and for bringing that up, Quentin. Sort of a fun segue, actually, into how technology and technological innovation can impact the way we work. That's one example, sort of the intersection of mental health and tech impacting a workforce. And I know Lyle touched on this as well with distributed manufacturing, but in general, if there are any other points you want to cover, just some ways that you've seen technological innovation impact the way we work. Could be in the past or in our current climate.
Yeah, I guess I will begin, because I think I may have, just by age, seen the longest arc of it, is the notion of, I guess, 3 areas. One, what does it mean to be present? I think that there are times that there used to be, I think Ariel alluded to it, is that there were clock watchers. She talked about her first job, and if you left at 6, I can't even recall what the term, you would kind of have to stay until after your boss left. But now I think presence means less quantity and more quality. And I think people for years have talked about working smarter, not harder. And I think it's more working at a higher level of creativity, which really comes from being present in the moment. We've too often, I think, saluted multitasking, but I think we're now learning the importance of being deeply engaged in the moment, because then you miss some of the subtleties, you miss some of the cues, you miss some of the things. I think the other thing that we've seen or will see is, and I am far from an expert, but I'm fascinated about how machine learning, artificial intelligence will affect, and how it'll affect how we deal with issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Because I think the hope is that technological process can remove bias, but a lot of these, algorithms are developed by human beings typically, I think most times. And so humans still have levels of bias. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how, as everybody pushes everybody to be, STEM, but will there be, and I would argue, more role for theology majors to maybe do, there you go, user experience roles with companies, or helping companies think of through type of potentially biases, and not just the normal way of diversity, equity, inclusion, race, gender, sexual orientation, or religion, but political ideology, location bias, ageism, differently able. There are a whole lot of things that have to be considered. So I'm a relentless optimist, but I do think that you have to, I think we have to really spend more time thinking about the mental side of the total employee, the total person that's coming to the forefront.
That note, I think I'll say from my perspective, one of the things that, technology, not all change is good in that sense, right? So I think of like Slack is a great example of like a GIF machine, right? That just like, I get bombarded with notifications from whether it's Slack or any of the other ones, right? And it's just like, I keep a notebook and a pen, right? Just so like, hey, I need to be focused in the moment, and I need to like sit in a room and just me, those thoughts, and get them down. And rather that's, that doesn't have to be a notebook, right? That can still be like do not disturb mode and do your thing, right? But there is so much competing for our attention, right? Like even when I try to like look at the news app on my phone, right? There's so many people trying to like push into my feed or different stuff, and it's like, wait a second, like I don't know why I opened my phone. Like what was I trying to do? What was I trying to look at? And so I think trying to be, so that's a way that I think technology has certainly changed within the last 5 years, right? Like on like, that just seems to be this ever increasing, like, ooh, there's always something else, right? There's always something new. And yeah, just like instant. And one of the things I've tried to, I think it's been a sobering experience as a kind of business owner and an employer on the like, great, I'm not, it's so easy to get distracted in that moment, and but there's value in like long-term plans, right? And it is very interesting to watch even our young employees, right? Like, so like who look at me like I'm old, which is crazy, but whatever. And we had a meeting the week before where we're like, okay, this is our like 60-day plan. And they're like, that makes sense. Great. And then like the next week we have a meeting and they're like, why are we doing this? And it just like something's missed. And it's like, yeah, we know it's a problem. Like we're still working on it. It's going to take at least 60 days for us to solve this big problem. Right. So like keeping track. I don't know. So I think that's that overwhelming, right? Like your attention is in, everyone wants to buy your attention, right? Your user data, and everyone's kind of pushing for that activity, and kind of striking that right balance of maintaining connection and being able to find the resources you need, but also being like treating your time like a currency on the like, what am I going to invest this in? And I'm going to be really careful about what I do, as like a balance to some of the negative impacts that I think this interconnectivity that technology brings to the workplace.
Yeah, I would say that my biggest interests lie in how companies change their hiring process. selfishly, just because it's what I've been working on for the last few years. But even outside of that, there's so many things. How companies are actually vetting and screening candidates. I argue that most ATSs, for those of you that don't know, an ATS is an applicant tracking system. So these are platforms that house all the applications that come in for any job that gets posted at a company. The troubling part is that there's an overwhelming amount of applications that go into that ATS. So I mentioned earlier, if you ever gotten ghosted or if you got the canned rejection email, it's not because you're not a good fit, it's because the recruiter probably never saw your application to begin with. So that visibility has been one of the biggest barriers for most job seekers. And I don't think companies are going to be able to just kind of do recruiting business as usual as they always have. There are no on-site interviews, right? And that's usually our chance of, giving the yay or nay on whether or not someone could be a good fit. Everything is going to happen virtually now. So figuring out how you're running remote interviews is going to be really important. Making sure that you're not compromising the experience, right? You're not flying people out to your HQ and putting them up at the W. So how do you make them feel, awesome throughout that candidate experience? But most importantly, I think there's that question of how are we qualifying applicants? And I love that every panelist has kind of brought up the importance of, embracing different fields within tech. I think the industry has a tendency to put engineering on a pedestal. So product design, data, ops, anything sales, especially sales, right? Marketing, all of these are really important functions to companies. And I think most of those opportunities are more accessible for people that are coming from varied backgrounds. So if you don't have a CS degree, or if you're not a self-taught developer, it doesn't mean that you can't work at a tech company. It just means you need to learn how to leverage your skills to find an opportunity that makes sense for you. So I think the challenging part is how do we help people kind of reskill themselves, because they're going to have to, but also what role do companies play in that reskilling? I'm a big believer that we cannot close the skills gap without relying on the market to help us, right? It is up to companies to help develop the current workforce and everyone that's to come. It's staggering, but I think the last time I checked, over 60% of the current workforce are not prepared for the roles that are coming within the next 5 to 10 years. And I am pretty sure that number has skyrocketed now in wake of the pandemic. So it's not enough for people to get on YouTube and learn UX design, right? Companies are really going to need to step up and thinking about how do we help people get qualified and prepared for the roles that we're hiring for? What role do we play in educating this workforce? And my hope is that companies will embrace more of kind of like a position of thought leadership as it pertains to education. I think that's going to be pivotal in order for people to get back to work.
I have to make a plug there. You just teed me up. I couldn't help it. No, I 100% agree with that. We've been so fortunate to partner with companies that are doing exactly that. And they see that skills gap and they're realizing, okay, the theology major could actually be an excellent addition to our tech team because they bring this perspective that maybe the CS grads don't have. So actually bringing these people into a technical training program, giving them the skills they need to perform these jobs, them adding them to those tech teams has been incredibly fruitful for our hiring partners. And then in this pivot, I've gotten to work with our team on the graduate accelerator program. So taking students coming out of bachelor's degrees and some master's degrees right now, and mostly non-technical backgrounds, providing them that free training and then getting them plugged in with their hiring partners. And it's just been a beautiful thing to watch. And you absolutely can get into the industry if you're coming from marketing, or even like I've met some chemical engineers that are pivoting to tech, and people from all these different backgrounds that are then bringing all of these new skills into the industry and those different perspectives that are so needed. So that's the end of my soapbox, but just, yes, I 100% agree with that. Back to you, Gant.
Oh, well, all right. Yeah, I'll take something. Honestly, I'm just going to echo everybody and say it's the age of data. I think we've heard that from everybody's answer. Quentin's talking about the data bias. Lyle's talking about the overabundance. Even we have the application tracking system. Our future of work is what we make of it in this age of data. There's a reason data analysts and data scientists make ridiculous salaries, which if you just found that out and you just realized you want a career in data science, go look up their salaries. But we're definitely in the age of data. And I think that's kind of the unifying point of all this. How do we unbias? How do we clear the information so that it's all signal, no noise? How do we make people responsible for training and educating and create a pipeline that can go forward? That seems to be the unifying aspect.
That brings me to a topic I really want to dive into with y'all. Sorry, Lyle, did you have something? Nope, you're good. Okay. Talking about how technology may be creating barriers to entry in the workplace. So how can we ensure that we're creating an inclusive and an equitable workplace while still implementing emerging technologies to better improve the way that we're working? So first part, identifying what barriers is the advancement of tech creating, and then what can we do to overcome those barriers and promote inclusion and equity?
Sure. I'll jump in a little bit there on the basically, right, it's really easy to live in a bubble, right? Whether it's a personal network, if you algorithms to their own devices are just going to be like, well, you like what this person likes, and you, okay, right? And you just have a whole bunch of people who look exactly alike and like the same things, right? That are surrounding you, and they're the easiest ones to find, and it gives you, I think, a false impression of what's really out there in terms of talent or backgrounds, right? And so I think that is a barrier to kind of getting diversity or different team talent in. And one of as like an anecdote, right? So we were kind of forced into this position hey, so we're talking about 3D printing and 3D design. And outside of, as a young company, I can't afford to pay like a traditional mechanical or electrical engineer. I was just like, I need somebody to like operate these printers. And so we partnered with a local high school, Rooted School. And that was an example of like, sounds great, right? To just, have an internship that can turn into apprenticeship and a hire. And they were in their pilot as well. And basically it turns out there's a whole lot of reasons why, like, you say no, right? In terms of kind of getting people from very different backgrounds, like, are just going to miscommunicate a whole bunch. And they're like, lots of reasons where like, I'm uncomfortable. This doesn't meet my expectation. Like, I'm out, it's over. Let me go back to my little personal network bubble of like, I went to high school with them or whatever else, right? New Orleans is like good and terrible at this, right? Like, it's just like, it exists of silos and like, where'd you go to high school? Who'd you know? Right? Like, et cetera. And it can be challenging to break through those barriers. And I think technology just makes it easier to connect with the people you already know often, right? My girlfriend and I have like the exact same Spotify playlist independently of each other, right? And like, that's just weird. But I think where that happened is, kind of what you were saying earlier, and Ariel was bringing about companies trying to step up. And I think it's a lot on education as well, on the like, hey, finding that kind of pushing in or reaching out, and companies saying, yeah, like, we'll have this internship or we'll have this experience, but it isn't just a field day, right? It isn't just like, let's show up for a day and like, ooh, cool, checks a box. And I think that's where places like Tech Talent South or depending on kind of where in this opportunity youth spectrum you are, right? The Youth Empowerment Project or some other places, having that kind of mediating force for us was, okay, so we had this internship, but there was someone behind the scenes, like setting the rules to it, right? And kind of coaching the kids, but also coaching us, being like, they're not going to be what you think they are, but you need to communicate to them directly, right? And kind of mediating that exchange. was a big thing, and incredibly surprising and very fruitful for us on the, just from a like return on investment perspective on the, hey, I can take, a 16-year-old student and 2 years of working part-time, and now it's like I've created the perfect full-time hire for me on, like, I know them, they've got a portfolio, they know everything we do and how we do it and why, and so like there's no interview anymore, right? Like the last 2 years were this interview, it's just like, hey Dorian, you want a job? Like, yeah you do, come on in, right? Like and so that's been a pretty I think powerful experience for us, but again it was one that is not without its challenges, and it is like, when I have those initial interviews, I always expect like a 16-year-old version of myself across the table, and it's like, this individual's background and upbringing is incredibly different from mine, and we're just gonna, like, I don't know, like you can get tense about it, and you're like, I'm just not comfortable, right? Like you're out, and you miss out on a whole bunch of stuff that way. And so I think having a relationship with that kind of intermediary organization that's like, trust us, we've worked with them for 2 years, they're great, you just don't see it yet, let them work for 6 weeks, and then to kind of smooth through those kind of potential miscommunications, I think are great.
Yeah, and Lyle, that's a weird part, because like you're solving an education problem, and I think that's the scariest part about this. When Blockbuster shut down and turned into Netflix, nobody complained, but you didn't have to be the smartest person in the room to work at Blockbuster, and I think that we saw the same gap, requiring, as the nation gets more and more intelligent, we are putting emphasis, and we've seen it from this pandemic, where having a computer so that you can have schooling from home, or having a quiet room where you can have a background, we're seeing this wage differential of people who don't have the ability to finance and buy these tools and get that education. And I find that's the most disturbing barrier to me, is that far too often, daddy buy me a computer is going to learn a lot more about the future of work than someone who's extremely motivated, who's unfortunately doesn't actually meet up with you and get that educational 2-year process. And I see businesses willing to take people from junior to advanced status. And I think that's a major barrier. I think that's probably, as we're going towards a creative work and an educational work, training on how to do these things is essential. And unfortunately, that leaves a weird gap behind on people who aren't kind of giving back.
I agree. I would say that overall, I think the hiring processes at the majority of tech companies are highly inefficient, and they have been for quite some time. Unfortunately, productivity has compromised thoughtfulness. And when I say that, it has everything to do from how you're vetting people at the top of the funnel to who the person is that actually gets the job offer. So if we're thinking about how people are coming in, I mentioned the volume problem that exists at all of these companies. You talked about Netflix. Netflix is hiring for over maybe 500 to 1,000 positions right now. Each of those jobs are going to get at least 1,000 applications. So it doesn't matter how big Netflix's talent team is. If the recruiters are strapped for time and they don't have the opportunity to properly screen and assess and qualify all of the applicants that are coming in. So I think it starts there. Largely, I find that the recruiters at these companies have a tendency to pattern match. So pattern matching is, what school did you go to? What company did you work at last? Did you work at a competitor? What type of experience do you have? Like, is it directly related or indirectly related? This is why it gets so hard for the job seeker, because your challenge is to figure out, how do I create a narrative that is appeasing to a recruiter? So if you are a career transitioner, maybe you're the chemical engineer and you really want the front end job at Twitter, you have to figure out, how do I tell the story so this person knows, hey, I can actually do this job, even though my resume and my LinkedIn profile says something very different. But again, I don't think it's up to the job seeker to do all of that work. It's just unfair. So companies are going to have to take a serious look at their hiring process, in figuring out, okay, how are we managing the pipeline of people that are applying for these jobs? How are we assessing or qualifying whether or not they're a good fit? What does a good fit even mean, right? And I challenge a lot of companies in this, because what people don't recognize is the recruiter, the person that is actively hunting for the job, and the hiring manager, i.e. the team lead or whoever you're going to report into, are not really on the same page ever, right? So the recruiter has an idea of what good looks like, and then the hiring manager says, oh no, this person is not a fit, and they have their own bias, right? So it starts on in just getting everyone on the same page. Hey, we're hiring for a UX designer. This is the checklist of everything that I think we need for this role. Is this correct? Just having that step in the process, you would be surprised how many companies don't even do that, right? Makes a huge difference on who gets access to the phone screen, who gets access to the first interview. If you're thinking about pattern matching, pattern matching isn't just keywords, it's also referrals. Over 80% of jobs are found through other people. And this is why the tech industry is so homogeneous, right? It lacks diversity because we're relying on people, the last 50 employees, to influence the next 100. And then we're also still doing the pattern matching and relying on the bias. Quentin, you mentioned ageism earlier. That's something that definitely doesn't get discussed enough in these talks. And, I have to be real, it's something that I was trained on as a recruiter. I remember one of my first jobs, they were like, make sure you look at what year they graduated college. Because if it's past a certain mark, they're probably going to be too old. Or the person that has 15 years of experience, too senior. Even if you're applying for a more junior role, they just automatically assume they're not going to be good in this role. They're going to want to manage people. They're not going to be an individual contributor, right? Like, there's so much bias, literally, that goes into making those judgment calls. So I think what we have to be mindful of is, how are we building tech to solve those problems, right? How do we make this process more efficient? But in the process of making it more efficient, how are we also not neglecting people? Amazon is a good example. They decided to build their own assessment tool in hopes of diversifying their engineering department. They ran it for 6 months, and they found out that they were discriminating against more people than they were before, right? So the question is, who develops the algorithm? What is the algorithm? Who are you to say whether someone is good or not, right? So making sure that companies are ushering in tools that are reflective of that, and also cognizant of, how do we make sure that people that don't typically get visibility, the career transitioners, the people coming from underrepresented communities, right? Obviously, I am not only a woman, but I am a person of color. So, I would be remiss to say that things aren't different for those communities. And the realization is, a lot of groundwork needs to be done. And I think at large, the industry has just been hesitant. And I'm hopeful that the pandemic, it's kind of blowing everything up, right? Like, how we've been doing things the past 20, 50 years is not working. And this is where it's gotten us. We have an opportunity to do something differently now. So my hope is that the process and how people hire, and also what they hire for, changes.
Well, if you don't have any other thoughts. Oh, go ahead, Quinn.
No, the only thing I would say is that I agree with all the barriers, but I do think one barrier, and it does go to the issue of bias, is that we've got to create safe spaces where people can honestly ask questions, make mistakes as we handle issues of race or gender or sexual identity or religion. Because I would tell you, I mean, I have had colleagues who were white men who say, look, I'm just nervous. I don't even know how to even approach the issue because I don't want to, in fact, I'm not going to approach it because there is no upside for me to approach it because I don't want to, the worst thing to be accused is racist or racially insensitive or bigoted. So they say, well, okay, so, you know, certain things that might rub people the wrong way. I don't want to feel, you know, I don't want to be accused of microaggressions. And so therefore I'm going to hire people who kind of get my humor or are going to have the same cultural reference points. Fair or unfair, that's just a reality. So I think that we're going to have to deal with that and maybe give people some grace. I mean, I think that's one thing that's sort of changed in the nature of work is the fact that there's much more attention today on non-verbal cues and just the primacy of language than it was when I began my career. And even though, you know, sometimes technology is billed as the great unifier. If you're bright, you're brilliant, you're going to be able to go forward, but it doesn't always work that way. But in a place like New Orleans and a lot of places in the American South that have significant sizable communities of color, if those communities are going to reach their full economic destiny, whether it's in Atlanta or New Orleans or Nashville or Memphis or wherever it might be, places where Tech Talent South is doing tremendous work, they're going to have to figure out how to honestly address this issue.
Thank you so much. And actually, our next question is all in your wheelhouse, Quentin. How do you think, and of course, anyone please jump in on this one, but how do you think that local, regional, and national workforce development initiatives have impacted the way that we work?
You know, I think that I would, as much as, you know, workforce development, talent solutions are a big part of what we do at the Business Alliance, and a big part of a lot of economic development organizations, I would have to grade us collectively with an I, incomplete. I think that we haven't really sat down and thought about, one, how do we create lifelong learners? I think what everybody has talked about is a need that even a Luddite like me, I have to figure out how to do Zoom, or at least understand what I don't know about Zoom. You know, I just can't ignore it. And I think there was a certain point where people could feel like, well, I'm at a certain point in my career, I can just ignore all the new stuff or all the stuff that makes me uncomfortable. That's not going to work anymore. I think workforce development is really, we probably need to change the way we frame it, is really talent solutions. And I think companies are looking for organizations like ours, or in New Orleans, Youth Empowerment Project, or Operation Spark, or other organizations in this space to provide a solution. Look, I have a demand signal. I need X number of people who can do X, Y, and Z, but I also need that same number of people to be able to potentially in the next 6 months be comfortable doing something totally different. And the supply side, K-12 education, higher ed, these alternative skill development organizations have to be flexible and facile enough to respond to that. But I also think the job candidate, him or herself, has to sort of control what he or she can control. You know, I tell people all the time, I'm a person who I'm really nervous about social media. I really am. I'm opinionated. You put something out, you can't take it back. So I really don't tweet. And if you don't tweet frequently, you're ineffective on social media and Facebook and whatever. But at the same point, if you're a serious job candidate and you don't have a LinkedIn profile, Ariel, I'll be curious to see what she thinks. I think it's hard for people to take you seriously. Maybe you can still be taken seriously. I don't know. Maybe it's now everybody's doing TikTok. I have no idea. I don't know. I just got a 16-year-old son, and he was like, yeah, we're Snapchat and all that's for you old people. We're on this something now. So whatever. But I think at the end of the day, our systems need to catch up with the pace of progress, but we also have to bring in K-12, early childhood. And the last thing I'll say is you can't say that talent is incredibly important and not pay the people who are in essence the coaches of talent. And those are educators. And so you're going to get what you get. I mean, I'm a big sports fan. If you want a great coach, you got to pay for it. And you got to pay for great position coaches. You just can't pay the head coach. You got to pay the position coaches in football. And we need to think about this as a nation with educators and others who are part of that whole value chain in knowledge acquisition.
OMG, yes. Pay teachers, please. It is long overdue. They are literally the gold of this country, and so pivotal to developing the workforce in general. So my hope is that teachers start to get the respect and the pay that they deserve in the wake of the pandemic. To answer your question, if you don't have a LinkedIn profile, no, I do not believe recruiters will take you seriously. So if you're on the call and you need to get your LinkedIn together, please do so. I'm happy to share some tips through, and hopefully we can get those sent out as well. But I think as far as it relates to workforce development, the ecosystem is, to me, getting everyone aligned and on the same page is probably the biggest challenge that most cities are facing. Speaking from my experience in New York, there was the New York City Tech Talent Pipeline. So it was New York's basically goal to get all of the companies that were HQ'd there, anyone that was actively hiring, all of the boot camps and all of the alternative education providers that have people coming through, and most importantly, the people that are actively job seeking, all kind of on the same page. So I've seen that under the lens of, a career coach during my time at General Assembly. So how do we help these grads actually get jobs? But I've also seen that, as an advisor working with CUNY, trying to figure out how are we structuring curriculum within state and city schools so it actually reflects what the market wants. And I can't tell you how many meetings I've gone to and I've left and I just wanted to cry. Because it's like no one is on the same page. No one is listening to anybody. How are we actually supposed to make a difference here? And since my time, I would like to say that the tech talent pipeline has actually improved a lot. I believe they even created some kind of task force that was dedicated to that, right? How do we help the people that are coming out of the boot camps and these alternative education programs find jobs at companies that are actively hiring in our communities? And I think that's something that each and every city is going to have to do. Atlanta needs to do it. New Orleans needs to do it. San Francisco needs to do it. LA needs to do it. Everyone needs to do it. But I think in the wake of the pandemic, as we talk about, that shift into remote work, and then also this next version of the Great Migration, you're going to have so many newcomers that are leaving these large markets, moving to more affordable cities with the hopes of, either finding a job or, kind of starting a new life. So I think that anyone that works in workforce development, needs to think about how do we make sure that everyone that touches the ecosystem is aligned, but also thinking out into the future. Anyone that's going to be coming, let's say moving to New Orleans within the next 5 to 10 years, how do we make sure that they feel welcome, and what kind of opportunities can we provide for them?
Well, my next point, we touched a little bit on this, but any additional thoughts you may have? How can educational institutions ensure that they're preparing students to enter the workforce?
Man, I'll take a first stab of it. I think part of the challenges, and there's a brokenness, and Ariel alluded to a little bit in the feedback loop in the ecosystem. So we need to pay teachers more. So that means compensation usually increase when you have barriers of entry into the profession, right? So that means licensing requirements. So it makes it more difficult for maybe an engineer or software engineer or somebody that says, you know, man, a company is going to give me a secondment. I would love to spend my secondment teaching math. I don't want to become a math teacher, but I'll do it for 1 year, or I'll do it for 1 semester. We really don't typically have mechanisms to accomplish that. So what happens is the education, the learning doesn't always feel relevant for young people. It'll be easier if you had someone who was an entrepreneur or something, or, you know, if Lyle in additive manufacturing came to school and said to a young man, young woman, here's the reason why algebra 2 might make sense for you to know algebra 2. It's going to have much more relevance than an algebra 2 teacher trying to convince them, because the kid is like, I'm definitely not trying to be a teacher, so this has no relevance to me. But man, Lyle's got it going on. He's got a great car. He does his own thing, whatever. Hey, I could get with that. So I think we have to think about making education relevant. I think the second point is we're going to have to narrow and add greater velocity to the feedback loop between private industry and education. And I think also this is a moment where I think higher education, whether it's at the 2 or 4 year, is really going to have to think about making sure that it keeps and stays relevant. I mean, once upon a time, it was education for education's sake. And while I still believe that, that is a very elitist and privileged view of the world. When education now is, you know, $40, $50, $60, $70,000 a year at some of these institutions. So I think relevancy is going to have to be the coin of the realm to figure out how to make that work.
Yeah. Teaching people to think. It's going to be key. It kind of comes back to the thing we were talking about earlier, where, you know, those colleges were so impressive because they had these giant collegiate libraries of everything and all these well-learned people. The information's out there. Knowing algebra 2 and getting to pass, teachers teaching to the test is the failure. And no one's telling them why. The answer is so that they can think, so that they can be constructive, so that they can adapt in this very wild and changing world, so that they can actually create these things. And that's the real thing. And it was so sad to me that we really need to tell them why more often. You know, we've seen in education, the way math is taught now has changed, and parents everywhere are telling their kids, this is terrible, this new math is terrible, and, you know, this is bad. Well, I mean, it's very demotivating for them. And even if the curriculum's great, the why is the real key to it. Couldn't agree more.
I'll say, Quentin, I don't drive a cool car at all, but I do go to schools and try to work with them. And there's some really cool examples of, like, I think teachers are often, right? If you think about someone who's writing a textbook, they have to invent like this word problem, right? Like someone has to sit down, and it's like, that's such a shame, because you could just like pick a business and be like, give me something, right? Like, here's a case study, right? So in business lingo, we use case studies and white papers all the time to be like, why should I care about your piece of equipment or like your business? And it's like, here's like basically a word problem that you've like are just going to spell out for me on like how this worked out and why. And so there's some really cool examples of how that's working. And as I've got involved in that process over the last 4 years, to Gant's point on the like teaching to the test is the failure and the importance of asking why. Well, it's why are public schools teaching to the tests? And it's because they need people it's how they're assessed, right? And like, if you want funding, you need like your school performance score needs to look like this. And there isn't an emphasis, and luckily in New Orleans, we're seeing some traction on the basically IBCs or industry-based credentials, where like, hey, schools get credit or they get points to their school performance score if students have these advanced certifications. But it's like the Wild West, right? In terms of like, I can't tell if it's a great thing or if it's like irresponsible, like how easy it's like, if you know the right person and you show up to like this meeting, and you're like, I want an IBC for this 3D printing program or this 3D design program. They're like, yeah, great, done. 50 pointers. And now like schools like in a whole system are changing their curriculum by it. And like, wait a second, like I'm not promising all these kids jobs. Like what have I done? And so I think that exchange is kind of way more complex and complicated than, but like all the more important to like sort through. But I definitely agree with Quentin on the like, hey, that relevancy. And I think the way we've tried to set it up is very interdisciplinary on the, so a good example, we worked with Rooted, and it was around the time they were taking down all the Confederate monuments. So students at Rooted were, hey, tasked to design monuments to replace them. So one, there is this technical challenge of, hey, use the 3D modeling program to make a thing. But then in English class, it's like, what is a monument, right? Let's read about them, write about them, like explain the why behind your story. And in math class, it's like ratios, right? So this is 1 to 4, right? Like you're going to have to make a scale. We're not going to show up to this presentation with like a full size statue, right? But you need to be able to demonstrate that like the numbers I've chosen in the size isn't just whatever, right? Like it's actually specific, right? So like, will that detail read in the print, or like, will I have to show a picture of it? And I think, you know, life isn't really broken down into subjects at all, right? Like we just make, subjects are these like abstractions that we make to like, so that we can talk about them a bit easier, right? But like they, in my real working life, right? Like they happen all the time concurrently. And it's just tough to kind of pull those apart sometimes. But yeah, so I think relevancy is a thing, and the sooner that you can get people building real things that matter, all the better, right? And that's why I like plug for 3D printers as like one of the most successful ways to do that. They are often treated like trinkets and like gizmos for open houses to like razzle and dazzle people. And like, that's such a shame versus like the simple economic problem of like, hey, can you design a thing on a computer that holds 2 pieces of paper together, right? Like it takes 15 minutes for a student and a browser-based program to like make a paper clip. And then like, oh my God, their world has changed, right? Like now they can put on their resume or their LinkedIn profile, like experience using advanced manufacturing equipment and rapid prototyping, right? Like super cool, but also real. I don't know.
Yeah, I would just echo proximity to the market is the most important thing. If you are not teaching people what they need to know to find the job that they want, what's the point? I mentioned the many meetings that I've sat through, you know, as an advisor for different colleges and universities, just making the argument to get project work as a part of the curriculum. Mary, I'm sure that you've seen this throughout TTS as well, but it's really important that you're teaching students not only the skill, but how it would apply within the environment that they work at. So I can teach you UX design, I can teach you product management, I can teach you web development. But doing that at Seamless looks completely different as if you're doing it at IBM, or if you're doing it at Salesforce, or if you're doing it for Netflix or insert any other company. So really understanding that the nuance of how companies work, the inner workings, right? How is everything related? This is, I think the frustrating thing is this is what is not taught, and this is probably what's needed the most if we're talking about someone being successfully onboarded and integrated into a new job. I don't want to think about, or I don't want to know about, you know, you just in your role. I want to know what is the impact that you have throughout the organization. So if, you know, you're studying, the best thing that you can do is figure out, okay, if I do become a designer, what does that mean for, how do I work with engineers? How do I work with product managers? How do I work with people in marketing and sales? I think often, you know, people just kind of have tunnel vision, not just on the skill, but just the job itself. So taking time to understand the bigger picture, how companies really work, is definitely going to be one of the things that I think needs to be taught a little bit more, so people can be successful as they transition into these roles. And then I would also say for anyone that is currently in school, or maybe you're a recent grad, one of the ways that you can kind of get ahead is just to make sure that you're showcasing your skills. So obviously teachers need to be working to implement project work into the curriculum so you have something to work on. But if you find that your teacher is not doing that, that doesn't mean that you can't go out on your own and do it for yourself, right? So, I mean, if you're a developer, you need to have a GitHub. If you're a designer, you need to have a Dribble. If you're none of those things, you should have a personal website. Do you have a portfolio, right? These are the things that matter. And it's more important for people that are career transitioners, and definitely students or people that are just recently learned a skill, because chances are your background tells a different story, right? So we talked about the chemical engineer that is now looking for this front end job. He has to be able to show, he or she has to be able to showcase, hey, I know that my degree says chemical engineer, but look at this really cool project that I did 2 months ago for a startup. Or please look at this prototype that I built, so you can get an understanding of my skill set and how I can be a value add to your company.
Well, I'm noticing we're already at 7:26, and I've already seen 6 questions come through and a few things in the chat. And I want to make sure that we leave ample time to get through those. Also, we've sort of organically covered a lot of the other points I wanted to hit today. So without further ado, I think I'm going to start in the chat, and then we can move to the Q&A box. For those still tuned in, if you have questions, please submit them through Q&A. We will do our best to get to them before we wrap at 8 Central, 9 Eastern. Let's see, I'm gonna scroll back here. Okay. Please address challenges in staff assessment and promoting people to higher levels of responsibility. Ooh, Ariel, is this fall in your wheelhouse?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's how are companies assessing whether or not people should be promoted, or what that management structure looks like. Correct me if I'm wrong. I would argue that it's yet another thing that is in desperate need of innovation. And I think most companies don't have I kind of take it back to skills mapping, right? Or road mapping, if you will. So if you start your career as X and your goal is to become Y within the next 5 years, what does that look like? I think companies do a really poor job of communicating that to employees. So often you're stuck in a role for a year and a half, and you're wondering, okay, how exactly can I move up? How do I argue for a promotion? If I were to move up, what opportunity actually makes the most sense for me? I think if companies spent more time during the onboarding stage, making sure that people have a strong understanding in terms of what the trajectory for their role or their position is, it alleviates a lot of those challenges down the road, right? So if you know that in 9 months, you can have a sit down with your manager or someone within HR to explore the possibility of a promotion, or explore the possibility of transitioning into a different department. This is definitely easier for consultancies and agencies because, you know, everyone is kind of a jack of all trades. But I think even for, you know, product companies, I recall, I'm not sure if Etsy still does this or not, but I believe they give 1 to 2 weeks of kind of, you can kind of flop teams. So if you're working in project management, but you really want to explore what design would look like, you can actually go work in that team for a couple of weeks to get an understanding of what that is. And then also coming up with a plan of figuring out, how do I transition into that role? I would love for companies to do more of that, because really it just comes down to understanding, and I mentioned this earlier, understanding how you can leverage the skill set that you have, the experience that you have and everything that you've built already to kind of get into that next role. But people can't come up with that roadmap on their own. Companies have to be able to help influence that. So I think that's one part of it. The second part of it is just making sure that there's a plan in place for promoting people. Often when I talk to tech companies, especially as it relates to diversity and inclusion, there's severely lack of representation of women and people of color in management and in senior leadership. And it's often because no one ever took the time to actually map that out, right? Like, what does a management training program look like? How long does it last? What do we want to teach these people? Who's involved? I would definitely argue senior leaders as well. I think hiring is always hard. I think it's definitely easier to get those entry-level positions filled. But when you're thinking about retention, when you're thinking about moving people into management positions, it really needs to come from the top. And if it's not a priority for anyone in the C-level, it's going to trickle down and not be a priority for anyone else. So I think making sure that you really develop a plan for the advancement of employees is important. But before you even start there, make sure that people actually know what's possible for them once they find a job at your company.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to the Q&A box. First question. I hear the panelists stating the future of work does not necessarily include having subject matter expertise. Since elementary and high schooling does not teach critical thinking, how will future workers gain the skills needed to success? Which actually was one of the questions we didn't get to touch. So thank you to the anonymous attendee who submitted that one. Anyone want to take a first go?
I'll take a first stab just briefly. I do think, schools are trying to teach more critical thinking. I don't know whether they are successful. I think we've all talked about project-based learning. And I think that's a step. I also think Gant has mentioned, I think to the extent that we can avoid teaching to the test and we can find ways to have multiple different assessments that help and understand that people have different learning modalities. I think that'll be very beneficial. But learning can occur in so many different places. The school is only one platform. I think there are social interactions. I think there are meetups. I think that you're now seeing, and we talked about, the power of YouTube and Google, and now they're doing one of the, there's a lot of tragedy with this, but the last thing I'll say is this is in some ways, if you have the technology, this tragedy has removed barriers of geographic space for people to participate in camps all over the world. Young people to learn things that maybe in their home geographies they may, or their home school districts. So I'm optimistic, but there's so many different levels and layers to the issue of learning that the school is only, schools in the traditional little red schoolhouse way are only one part of it.
Yeah, I'll say for me, a community makerspace was how, right, like I came back from my time abroad and was like, I want to learn real skills, but had a job at the time, and so it didn't make sense to like kind of go to a community college or whatever else. I will say there are a lot of really good like technical programs at community colleges that are often underutilized, but outside of that, I think this kind of flexible on like a weekly meetup, right? There are all sorts of different levels for you to kind of engage yourself, and whether certainly in my field that's in the like robotics group or kind of community makerspace, but also public libraries have a bunch of programming and resources that in my experience have often been kind of pretty well supplied and underutilized. So I think those are a couple avenues I would look at.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Let's move on to the next one. There are certain soft skills which are needed in the world of work that are hard to develop remotely. how will future workers practice soft skills to succeed in remote circumstances?
I think that there's a ridiculous number of people who, once you actually look at these kinds of things, there are organizations around helping people with their EQ, with their soft skills. I feel like the books from before these times, if you take it like the Drucker effective executive books, like the connections that we're making, so much of this information is just still out there. And funny enough, like as we're developing things remotely, I think we need to listen to them and work on them in our remote space. It was easy to accidentally form these skills, but without even looking at those tools. Now I think the tools are more important, and you need to refine them, because you can't just get good at finding out how everybody is doing around the water cooler anymore. You have to actually implant and put emphasis on humanity with one another in a remote space. I think we've seen that a bit. The commercial saying we're all in this together, people see right through that. But companies who are giving away services and being friendly and connecting people, everybody's going to remember that kind of stuff.
Straight from the mouth of the king of remote work. If y'all missed Gant's talk during Proximity Conference, please check it out on YouTube. It's about leading a remote workforce, and it's excellent. Just a spoiler, he does become an amorphous rainbow cat at one point, but I'll leave it at, there's a lot of good information there about how to bring humanity into remote work. So do check it out.
That's true.
It's pretty great. Next question. Two questions from this attendee. It was mentioned earlier that the capability to complete 7 or 8 hour of 7 or 8 hours of work remotely in 4 to 5 hours. What are your opinions on a 4-hour workday, given that productivity remains the same as during a full 8-hour workday?
I'm a fan of the 4-hour workday. I am a fan of do whatever you need to do to get the job done. And as long as you get it done, I don't question your process. And I think Gant mentioned this earlier. It's not necessarily the quantity of how much time you're working on something, it's the quality. This isn't necessarily work related, but I think back to high school. There was a guy in my AP history class that I couldn't stand. I hated him because he never really tried, or at least it didn't look like he tried. His desk was always a mess, like crumbled papers, like scattered around. He never really had a book bag. It was just like, who is this dude? And he would ace every AP exam, every single one, to the point we started to question, does the teacher have favoritism towards this guy? What's the deal here? There's no way whatever he's doing is working. He went on to Chapel Hill. I don't know where he is now, but I'm sure he is doing very well for himself. And I say all of that to say it worked for him, right? I didn't understand his process. I wasn't necessarily a fan of how he presented himself or how he did things, but he found a way to ace every task and make it to every class. And I say all of that to say, I think it's going to be a really big opportunity for people, just to shine in the constructs that they build for themselves. And I think that's something that can be a little bit difficult if we're thinking about how work happens pre-pandemic, right? Maybe you don't have the water cooler anymore, but how much of a distraction was the water cooler? How many meetings have we realized actually can be emails and be calls? So I think the silver lining is that, people inherently will become more efficient because there isn't as much of a distraction. I remember my time at GA, I think I was in the classroom maybe 1 to 2 hours out of my day, The rest of my day was spent in meetings and one-on-ones, right? Working from home, which everyone would have to do, realistically, I would be able to get everything done in 4 hours. And I would argue that the majority of people can. So my hope is that employers understand this and they give people the flexibility that they need to be able to do their best work. But I would also say, just being cognizant that, again, this isn't typical remote work, right? So it's not just as easy as you sitting in your office and turning on your Zoom cam. Maybe you don't have an office. Maybe you have 5 kids running around in the background and you don't know what to do with them yet because you haven't found childcare, right? Like, everyone needs to be in this state of efficiency, but also, I think, grace, right? Like, how do we make sure that we are putting people in the position to do their best work, but we're also not overstressing or downplaying the effect that the pandemic has had, especially on the mental health of employees.
Yeah, I think I really, for me, the kind of goal of that 4-hour workday as an employer is like, I want balance for my employees, and right, I don't want anybody punching a clock. But I think there's another side of this is not just a 4-hour workday, but it's like, hey, today's a big day. Today's a 12-hour day, right? So like, there's flexibility on like, there's a thing that we like, PPE was a great example. And like, our employees really stepped up, and it's like, hey, today's a day where we need to make, 2,000 of these things for these people, right? So like, no 4-hour mentality. It's like, the work needs to get done when the work needs to get done. And if you can do it in 4 hours in a day, awesome, right? Like, spend the rest of the day is yours. And obviously, like, balancing expectations with like personal health and wellness there, and understanding that like, at some point, like, there are going to be those situations where, it's important for my employees to have a reserve of like energy and like, I guess just health, right? To know that like, sometimes we have to spend those to get this thing across the finish line. And that like, and so there aren't, if you turn the 8-hour workday into a 4-hour workday and people are still like punching the clock, I think the same problem has come around again. And it's just, you have less time to do those things. And it's the like, hey, let's work on those skills to recognize like, what's the priority? How do I schedule? When does that happen? So I think it's less about the quantity of hours, right? And about that communication and prioritization, and then like execution. And that, I think by and large, most of your standard day, right? Like, if you're handling that well, I think 4 hours is like a reasonable amount of time to get, a good day's worth of work out. I just kind of, with our employees, it's I don't know what the next day is going to look like. And if we're a team and like, what is the fan, right? Like, all hands on deck, what do we do? But we're not like locking anybody in or anything. I don't know.
Second question from that attendee regarding mental health. Some studies suggest that a lesser workday would even lead to higher productivity and a better mental health for the workplace. Do you think if a shorter work week were implemented, we would see a healthier working population?
I mean, I would say it all depends. I think it depends on, are people engaged in the work. It's not a black and white necessarily, the number of hours. I think it's literally, are people engaged in the activity? I mean, there have been times I've worked 16, 17-hour days. It didn't feel like work. I mean, because you're so engaged, you're just vibing with your colleagues, your teammates. I think what people are seeking, or at least one view of what people might be seeking, is a level of equal investment and recognition of what shared sacrifice and shared commitment to the goal. I find that, if you thank you or acknowledgement when a person has made a contribution or a team has made a contribution, can buy you a couple hours of grace when you need it on the back end. After someone has worked 12, 13 hours and, as Lyle mentioned, it has hit the fan and I got to get something to RL by tomorrow. and that means we're going to have to be cranking all night. That thank you may have been the fuel, but I also have to realize on the other end, I have to be flexible. If Gant says, hey, after pulling that all-nighter, hey, can I have the next 2 days off? I didn't see my wife. I didn't see my son. I missed this play, or I missed this ball game, or I missed my daughter's dance recital, or my significant others, whatever. Companies that figure out the human dimension and really view talent as human capital are the ones that are going to be the winners. Because that's the true assets.
100%. That is it. You know, it's not having less work that's the key. It's having, like you were saying, it's flexible work, because people are happier the more control they're given. And that's the thing. If I control my workday and I know that, you know what, honestly, some days I just have a bad day. And Quentin, if I came in, I said, I'm having a bad day. And you're like, the best thing somebody can say is like, go home, take a nap, rest up, bring your best work tomorrow. And people do this in other countries. We don't do it here. Here, you sit in that seat for 40 hours. You're there a little bit before the boss, and you leave ever so slightly after the boss, maybe 15 minutes, like we were saying earlier. It's not how real work should happen.
Awesome. Let's see if this one was a comment. Our next question. Okay, this is for Ariel, and it's very hypothetical, the disclaimer from this attendee. Do you see employers waiving the at-will employment clause for candidates they really need?
That's a good question that I haven't even spent much time thinking about. You know what? I don't know. It is a very hypothetical question. I think our mindset and our perspective on what an essential worker has completely changed during this pandemic as well. As far as like the at-will clause, it's hard to call. I think companies are going through a lot of shifts right now. Many are having to be forced to do layoffs or furloughing employees that they didn't necessarily anticipate. So I would definitely think that at some point people are kind of going back to those contracts and those offers and thinking about, okay, what is the verbiage here? What exactly are we promising and what are we not? It's funny, I was talking about non-competes the other day, and a lot of people take non-competes really seriously, and my argument is there is no non-compete if you're living in San Francisco or New York, because you have to find work and everyone is competing with everyone. So can you really expect someone to honor that? So, I mean, all that to say, I think the times are really going to dictate what has been typical in terms of the relationship between employers and employees. But I do think that things will become more flexible as an effect of the pandemic, and then also just the future of work changing as well. I mentioned earlier that job seekers are kind of getting their power back and employees are getting their power back, and I think companies recognize that. So I would anticipate that they become more competitive in terms of what they're offering, and then also try to find more ways to retain the employees that they hire. So I think the answer to that question is it is TBD, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
All right, thank you. Our next question, my question or observation, another disclaimer. I recently was asked by a recruiter for my year that I got my bachelor's degree. What or is there a way of getting around this? So a way of getting around disclosing when you got your bachelor's.
That's hard. I mean, I usually tell people don't include it on your resume if you don't want to. But if someone has already asked you, that's a little difficult, right? Because you don't want to be dishonest. I think that's a little circumstantial. I would need more context around the conversation with the recruiter and what their needs are. I would also need to know when this person did graduate and what kind of job they're looking for. So if you want to ask this offline in a safe space, I'm happy to do that.
The only thing I would say observationally is typically people who do not have their graduation years are people who usually graduated in the 90s or before. Just been anecdotal, seeing thousands of resumes and just talking to search firms. That's just been what I've been told. So I think if you don't put it on there, it's probably a cue. But I think much more important is the language you use. I think there are certain language on a resume that will have people believe that you're either up to date, current, or dated. And I think that you can be a very dated 25-year-old, but you can be a very current 70-year-old person. I think it all depends on how willing you are to keep up with the trends and pursue best practices and how you present your case.
It's specific to profession, I think, as well. Funny is that in technology, there's a weird mix with ageism kind of in there, because it's sort of understood. I'd say the curve goes like this. You've got very low, and then when you get 5 years of experience, you're extremely valuable, and then you probably want to like hide the fact that you got your bachelor's in the 90s. And then there's all these neck beards, these really genius guys, or like these people who've been in the industry for way too long, who speak at every conference, and when they talk, people gather around them like Socrates, and they kind of comes back. So it's hard to tell. And I think what you're saying is, and what I've seen is people get to choose what it looks like. I've been in this so long, I've seen the industry, I have the wisdom. Or, hi, I've been working on, BlackBerries since the 90s. Will you hire me? It's like, no, that is an antiquated technology, and it's going to be hard for you to get a job.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, our next attendee question. Ooh, okay. Lyle, this may be a fun one that will speak to your heart. Interesting as I listen. I'm a pastor with a theology major, planning a career change after being a tech hobbyist for 20 years, and I've just graduated from Flatiron. I appreciate your comments, and I'm trying to find a company to build and grow and have core values which align with my faith life. More of a comment, but if there are any thoughts on that one?
Good luck. No, I think, yeah, I don't know. I think culture's yeah, no, I don't know how to handle that one in a constructive way, other than be who you are and make sure that you're interviewing the company as much as the company's interviewing you on, is this going to be a good fit for me, and am I going to feel safe and respected showing up day in and day out?
For sure. I would echo that. It's interesting. I find this often from career transitioners coming from nonprofits because their hearts are still in a really good place, right? Like they still want to help people and not get eaten up by a tech company that is doing, maybe strange or dangerous things through AI. So to make sure that you don't get in that scenario, I would suggest actually looking into social enterprises. You can just do a general Google search. There's also a conference called SOCAP. It's spelled SOCAP. I would maybe just look at people that have spoken before, or even companies that have sponsored, because it sounds like what you're looking for is ethos and kind of that vision and mission alignment. And I think that's something that can be hard to decipher. Definitely looking at a company's careers page, like you don't know what they're really like. They're just showing you pictures of the last company outing or everyone on vacation for like this sales thing. So I think structuring your search to where you are looking for specific types of companies that embody your values is going to be important for you. So you land somewhere that you like and you don't leave within the next 6 months. I would also say it sounds like you graduated from Flatiron. I do know that the Flatiron alumni pool is pretty large at this point. And that's my suggestion to anyone coming out of a boot camp. Please talk to alumni. You would be surprised how many people go through the program and never talk to the people that were in the program with them, or talk to the people that went through the program before them. And you want to talk to alumni specifically because chances are they've landed jobs by now, right? And you can start to get a sense of what's possible. So do a LinkedIn search for Flatiron grads. I'm not sure what market you're in, but obviously market doesn't matter right now because everything is remote anyway. So have at it. But I would say just spend a little bit more time on the front end building a strategy for your job search so you can optimize the results that you want.
Awesome. And we're at 7:55 Central. So I think this will be our last question, a long one. So bear with me. I'll go through this slowly, make sure I catch all of it. So hi guys. First, thanks for putting on this event. I'm across the pond in the UK, so it's pretty late for me right now. I would love to know the panel's view on something rather specific, but hopefully with some interest more broadly. So here it goes. I work in defense, or spelled with a C, or defense, spelled with an S, as you guys might call it. Defense and the wider public sector have always had an awkward relationship with the private sector and business. I think that that relationship is ready to change, and I also think that it needs to change. Clearly, the current crisis is a useful catalyst for that. How do the panel think the public service and business can benefit from each other further than an over-enthusiastic army guy from the UK staying up late to try to and learn something from some cool people? Can we really start to intertwine our networks of thought? And is there a future where we can collaborate better across the intersector divide and improve things like our responses to major crisis? Thanks again, guys. Oh.
Go ahead. Lau, go ahead. I would say kudos for staying up late in the UK. Just very briefly, I think this is an unprecedented and unparalleled opportunity for people who are interested in helping the public sector, particularly government, think about how to reinvent itself, how to leverage technology, how to leverage AI, also helping policymakers really think critically about technology. I mean, in order to be engaged in technology, you don't necessarily have to be the technologist. You can be a person that facilitates the environment for technology to grow, thrive, reproduce itself. I do think in the defense sector, whether it's cybersecurity, there's been all types of conversation about security of lab facilities and clinical research and things of that nature. I think they're going to be unprecedented opportunities. I think it's just a matter of what the particular questioner is seeking. As far as international cooperation, I really think that despite the rhetoric that may be coming from certain world capitals, I think this tragic pandemic has definitely told all of us we can behave irrationally, but we're all in this together. There are no national borders. This coronavirus doesn't care whether you're British, American, French, Spanish, Chinese, Algerian. It just doesn't care. So I think that it really is a great time if you're really thinking about how to bridge the public sector and the private sector, leveraging technology. I think the world is really going to be your oyster. You just have to figure out which entry point you want to pursue.
For sure. I think this, outside of kind of defense, I mean, I think there are some pretty substantial blockers, honestly, to the like clear collaboration between kind of public and private sectors, and COVID's kind of revealed them on the, for example, if you're making face shields, right? It's only when the FDA says like, great, anything is better than nothing. But even then, right? Like I'm cautious as a business owner to be like, look, this person is asking me for something. Okay, I can help them. But let me take it, like if I'm got my risk assessment hat on, like what are the odds that like one of my face shields like breaks in the middle of a surgery and like I get sued into oblivion, right? Like there are like all sorts of litigation or like litigious reasons kind of standing in the way, and also proprietary, right? So I was looking, I'm getting asked to make hands-free hand sanitizers. And so I'm trying to buy parts for like these little motion activated faucets. Well, it turns out like you can only lease them from the company, and it's like proprietary and they can show up. And so there are all these kind of like weird logistical barriers. So I think for a better way forward, I think leaning on, and something the tech community has, I think, kind of found a good balance of, is going to be this mix of like open source, right? Like I think there's a lot, if you're inviting these people to collaborate, you can, I think, find a way to innovate and monetize without necessarily like patenting or owning a thing, right? And I think having this kind of common discourse around like what that can look like as it relates not just to like algorithms or file types, but down to like products or like essential goods and services, right? And so where are those areas where that interchange can happen that doesn't stifle the innovation of like, well, what's the point in me spending all sorts of sleepless nights making a thing if I put it online and now someone else has it?
But the weird part that kind of unifies that is following the money. And I think that that's the biggest fix for this, because this person's in defense, and here in the States, defense budget's not our problem. As a matter of fact, that's where AI is going to, unfortunately. That's why there are walkouts at Google. AI being applied to make us have deadlier weapons and worse drones. We're actually kind of having to take a stance, and the other countries actually don't have nearly the same kind of rhetoric around this kind of argument. And the trick is, that's where money is. A little bit earlier, we talked about how to help the government. And I think that the open source, I love giving open source, but you can build so much more if it's funded. And actually, I think funded apps build open source. People start to get tied into this. And so major open source libraries that we use have major financial backers, React and PyTorch or Facebook, TensorFlows with Google. So I think that the key here is that for the public and the private sector to work, we need the money to actually fit. Honestly, putting money back into education. If there was government funding to build educational programs to work during this, that sort of like solves backwards all the problems we were talking about, and then actually measuring that. So the weird part here is that I'm sure this is by coincidence, but this person's in defense in some foreign country. We do have a follow the money, and that's actually where our public and our private sectors are constantly iterating. If anything, we are not focused on the things we're helping people, getting tests out during this epidemic, making sure mental health is a thing. There's still a huge portion of political population that thinks that mental health is a choice, not actually a chemical state. And I think that's just the lack of education eating itself. So I'll say that I would love there to be more open source. I'd love for people to give money to that. And honestly, budgeting towards making that sector, blurring those lines between what's public and what's available would be phenomenal. I just think that we've got to put it in the right spots.
Yeah, I'd say I'd treat it like infrastructure, right? In the same way that a good open source library can be like public infrastructure, right? In that like it's a resource that other people are going to build on, and I'd love to see it that way. And the last note is there is public money out there, and often a lot of it, but the mechanism to get to it is so stupid and clunky that like people don't see it, and it's so hard. Like government websites are terrible, right? And like they don't really advertise. You need to register, and if you don't have the right NAICS code, and those haven't been updated since the 80s, and then it's like you can't apply for a bid, right? And it's like, or sometimes you have to print it out and like hand it in person, and it's like very obtuse. And that like, so I think there's a lot that the government or like the public service is missing out on, in terms of there are plenty of willing and capable people or businesses who could solve these problems faster and cheaper than you imagined. You just met them where they're at, right? Like instead of being like, well, nope, like you have to fax it to me. It's like, I don't have a fax machine in my state of the art like office here, right? Like no way for me to fax you something. So like, what's going on?
Well, we are just 5 minutes past 8 Central. Thank you all so much. This has been such a blast for me. I've really enjoyed getting to pick your brain and hear about your collective insight, but also your unique backgrounds have just brought such I can't even think of the word I'm looking for, such perspective for me personally, just getting to learn from manufacturing, and Gant, your wealth of experience in tech, and Ariel on the people and culture side, and Quentin with your background in economic and workforce development efforts. I'm very grateful. Everyone who's still tuned in for the full 2 hours, cheers to you. Thank you so much for staying with us. I'll be sure to send a follow-up email. We will be posting this to our YouTube channel also. So if you missed anything, don't worry. Or if you want to watch this all again, you can. Please share it if you think that there's someone who would enjoy. And panelists, do you have anything you'd like to share with everyone in closing?
Specifically, I would like to stay in touch with people and continue this communication. I put my Twitter account here. Quentin, a Twitter account sort of like faxing, but in the future here. Just joking. I would love to stay in touch and actually chat about all this stuff all the time. Please actually, if I can get everybody's email and contact information to continue this, especially talking about some of this in my home city, New Orleans. Ways that we can bring some of the ideas that we talked about to force.
I'll be sure to connect y'all via email. Sorry, Quentin.
Yeah, please do. And I just want to thank Tech Talent South, and it's been an honor to serve with the panelists. I've learned a lot. I would say, amid all this, I think 2 things: humor and optimism. We're going to get through this. We're going to be better. We got to figure out a way to have some laughs amid this, and just believe that we're going to be better.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all again. Go ahead, Ariel. Sorry, I saw you flip your...
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I agree. Thank you so much for having me. Anyone that's actively job seeking, please forward over your questions if they didn't get answered. That is my opportunity to do good on this earth. So I would love to be helpful if I can. And my last words would be to stay safe, stay healthy, and stay optimistic.
Yeah, echo that. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Hope folks are doing well and staying healthy.
So thank y'all. And we'll be sure to keep you posted about other events coming up soon. So stay tuned, stay safe and well, and we'll see you next time.